Now, before I turn the sort of non-existent podium over, I would just like to offer the personal reflection that, as a colleague of these two women, that they and other colleagues whom we acquired in the merger have enriched our department to no end, bringing a different perspective to the study of history and to teaching. Not only a different perspective on gender, but quite frankly, an alternative way of doing things. One which tends to be more participatory and more student-oriented. One which tends to be less hierarchical and tends to break down the barriers that sometimes exist between teachers and students, and also between and among colleagues. And I am very grateful for this opportunity to say that, and how much that has enriched the life of the department and my own life as a scholar and a teacher. They are here tonight to talk to us about Mundelein Voices, the women's college experience, 1930 to 1991. The experience of being associated with an institution that still means a very great deal to many people in Chicago, at Loyola, and indeed in the nation. It's my great pleasure to give you Professors Anne Harrington and Prudence Moylan.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that very generous introduction. Bob has been a very welcoming colleague in the history department, I might add, also. What we're going to do tonight is divide our time into two pieces. The first piece is the process of putting the book together, and the second piece is the content of the book. And in each section, Prue and I are going to go back and forth. So I'm going to begin by saying how this whole thing got started. About, I don't know, 1994 or 95, the Center for Faith and Mission, Gertrude Patch was at that time in charge of it. She asked me to give a talk on Justicia Coffey, Sister Justicia Coffey, the first president of Mundelein. I had never done any research in the history of Mundelein College, and I really didn't do much research for that talk. I mean, I looked at what we had, but in looking at what we had, I realized how little there was in writing. And so one day when I was walking across campus, I bumped into Prue, and I said, somebody's got to write a history of Mundelein College. And my intention in saying that was that Prue would do that. I really had no intention of getting involved at all. But Prue had another idea. And I'll let her tell you what that idea was.
So we were standing out there between Damon Hall and Madonna della Strada and the skyscraper. And I said, well, you know, we have these examples. We both had participated in and are members of the Conference on the History of Women Religions. And we've both been invited to write essays for the biographical dictionary, Women Building Chicago. And in both cases, we had learned about dividing up the labor. There are, of course, more than 400 contributors to Women Building Chicago. And the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary had gathered a group of about a dozen members of their congregation to write different aspects of their congregational history. So, thinking, well, I'm not going to do it, you're not going to do it. So, why don't we figure out a way to invite people to do parts? And we agreed that that would be good, parcel out the work. And so then our first step was, okay, how are we going to get this organized? We need help. So we went to Carolyn Farrell at the Gannett Center for Women in Leadership and said, you know, we need help. Well, she's always very gracious. So she said, well, you can meet here. She also went on to find us support and, you know, gave us much more of a meeting place. But we did decide to ask some of our colleagues to join, and so we created a steering committee and enlarged the conversation. Before long, and we brought to the steering committee the idea of essays, and kind of said, would you write one? And they were like, well, okay, so that sort of became a reason for being on the committee, or an obligation. And we proceeded to have periodic meetings, also trying to use the background that we had learned from these other organizations to formulate guidelines for writers. And as we did that and sent them out, of course, we were interdisciplinary by that time. It wasn't just two historians. And people were a little nervous about writing traditional historical essays. And we had the benefit of Mary Griffin's presence on the steering committee. And she suggested that the memoir was a wonderful new sort of form of narrative that combined personal experience with history. And would that be a way to get the essay? So from the idea of the dividing up the labor of historical essays to the idea of really reaching out to writers who would combine their own experience with the story of Mundelein, we developed what you now get to read. And I had to move on to engage more people. I guess I jumped ahead of the process here. So
A little bit, but that's all right. In putting together a steering committee, we started with the classic Mundelein History Department. Joan Frances Crowley, Sister Joan Frances Crowley, Paula Pepper, and the two of us. And then we added Sister Mary DeCook, who has written quite a bit of community history. And that was the first group that met. And then we decided we had to enlarge it, so we had another meeting where we included Sister Annetta Gannon and Valerie Brown, the archivist for the archives on women in leadership, and Sister Janelle Bergen. And they came and we kind of went through the kinds of materials we would need, and they have been tremendous supports throughout the entire project. It was, without their help, we would have been in water way over our head. That first meeting that we had, the first meeting with the steering committee, took place in April of 1997. So that's how far back it goes. And we had some 24 meetings. And that doesn't count the times that Prue and I had to meet to plan the meeting or the meetings with the press. So it was a lot of talking and communicating. But in the process of enlarging the group a little bit, we began to tap different writers, and people would suggest someone, and then they would go after them and try and get them. And so eventually we enlarged the group, and we already talked about the memoir format. One other thing we did with the writers was we had writers' meetings. When we actually engaged writers, we invited the people who had agreed to write an essay to come to a meeting up in the Gannon Center. And then they would talk about what they were going to write, or as it moved along a little bit, they brought some of their writing. And that was a great boon to the whole project, because number one, it reminded the writers that they had committed themselves to something. Number two, it gave them a little impetus because they had to come and talk about what they were going to do. And thirdly, it gave us a chance to hear what people were thinking about, what they were writing about, and we could give each other feedback. So it was a very supportive kind of an atmosphere.
It sort of took us back to the inspiration we had in the beginning, which the Immaculate Heart of Mary sisters had talked about feminist approach to their work, which meant both kind of looking at the way women fit into the larger culture, but also using the non-hierarchical approaches and asking for contributions and building up sort of the circle of knowledge. So we were really delighted by that. But we did our hierarchical thing too by reminding everybody by sending those letters out. They were obligated, so.
Well, and then in the midst of all this, one of our colleagues, Mary Griffin, who was a very vital member of the committee, died very suddenly. And we were kind of reeling from that, and I actually had the thought, it's not going to go, we won't go on. But we had also, by that time, committed ourselves to present a panel at the Conference on the History of Women Religious, which was being held here at Loyola. And so we presented our work in progress, and we got very positive feedback. And I think that event, after that session at the conference, I knew it was going to go. So that was a great step forward, that we went ahead and did the presentation at the conference. And then Prue will talk about how we got the book into a presentable format for the press.
Yes, one of the things we were and then nervous about, of course, and really in terms of losing Mary Griffin, I had a little bit different experience from Anne in the sense that it was kind of a reminder to me. My mother died before I finished my PhD, so I was like, oh, I have to finish it now. And Mary Griffin sort of operated as the same kind of mentor in my life. I thought, oh, she'll never let us drop this now. She's got even more influence, so we should proceed. So it was, finding encouragement out of the sense of loss. But the other amazing thing, of course, was whether or not we'll actually get the essays. And so we were absolutely delighted when the 18 people who had agreed to write all wrote. And in June of 1999, yes, I think it was June of 99, 2 years, so almost 2 years after we started, we had all the essays collected. And we had asked two colleagues of ours, being concerned about editing, and then we had to explore what the role of editor would be. And we thought, well, we cannot really be the people who go through all the essays and do the critique, because we're the encouraging part of the team, getting the writers and wanting them to and affirm and be delighted with what they had done. So we had asked two of our colleagues, Paula Pfeffer and Sister Lorianne Lifka, to do the work of editing. So we sent them all the essays in the summer of '99 and asked them to use our guidelines, which we had sent to the writers, and to go through all the essays and identify the places where we needed to be more consistent and make changes stylistically. So they were the first to really look at the consistency all the way through. And we were very encouraged also by their enjoyment of the essays. And they then got us to the point where with some secretarial help, again, with Carolyn's support, we were able to then have them all put on computer disk with consistent stylistic principles. And then we were able to pursue our relationship with Loyola Press.
And in terms of the help from the Gannon Center, Carolyn was able to get a grant from the Rice Foundation and from the BBM congregation, which helped immensely just with the talking with the editing and things. And then in working with Loyola Press, I did most of the contact with the press, and it was a very nice relationship. The press was extremely easy to work with. It also, for me, then they brought out the kind of book we envisioned too, picking up the Art Deco up here, and the image of the skyscraper, and what we call it, drop leaf.
Mundelein colors.
Yes, Mundelein colors, that was their idea. And it was also, for me, a learning in cyberspace because they sent the entire book back as an attachment. All the copy editing done, right, in color on the text, which I had never seen before, and then I had to accept or reject their changes, make my own changes, all online, which I've never done, not online, but on the computer, and that was an experience. It was very nice. It worked out pretty well. We had a few comments on a few mistakes that slipped through, but not too many. And the whole process culminated when the book came out in May of 2001. And we had a great celebration of the publication of the book in the McCormick Lounge on June 27th. So now we'll move to what's in the book.
One of the pleasures that Anne and I had and kind of shared was that when we after we had our colleagues go over the consistency of style and all, we, of course, had to sit down and read the essays ourselves in order to write the introduction that go to Loyola Fest. So we were going to divide up the labor, and I was like, okay, we can come in, we'll leave them in the Gannon Center, and we'll take turns. So the two of us arrived there one morning together and thought, okay, well, we'll take some time, I can't stay too long. And, 6 hours later, we were still there saying, oh, isn't that fun? Didn't you think this? Oh, wait till you read that essay. So we were quite intrigued and delighted with our sort of sense of the whole. And had to come up with some sense of writing the introduction to say, what should people look for? We knew it wasn't a traditional history, but we did have a sense of chronology. So as historians, we could say there was an overall chronological sense. And the themes were really reflective of Mundelein, what Mundelein meant to so many people. So what we saw, and you may have seen others if you've had a chance to read the book, was first of all the importance of the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Came through in different ways in all the essays. So in being members of the Conference on the History of Women Religious, we've been thinking about a new way to tell the story of women religious in American society. And this turned out to do that through the experience of the people who participated at Mundelein, whether or not they were members of the congregation. And then the other thing, which had been our experience, but we didn't know whether it would come through, and we found it in the essays, is the tremendous love of learning which characterized the experience of being at Mundelein. The faculty-student relationship, the student excitement, and of course we realized also with all the struggle, there was never an opportunity to be complacent. Learning was what really mattered to us, so we shared it, and that came through with energy. Also, what came through for, I think, students, faculty, staff was that there was a personal transformation involved in their engagement with learning and with the faculty and with the UVM congregation. So that idea of a college experience being one of personal transformation, just part of what's reflected in other literature about colleges, came through in the essays. And then I was particularly interested in the way in which illuminating the relationship between men and women came through. The men who contributed to the text all commented in some way about how their assumptions about women religious and about women students had been challenged and reshaped as they came to Mundelein. So those were some of the key insights that we enjoyed and convinced us that it was the story of the college, even though it was many individual memories.
Well, then I looked at the breakdown of the contributors, which I had not done in any formal fashion until preparing for this evening. There were 16 women who wrote and 4 men, and 1 essay that was a joint endeavor. David Orr, who's the Cook County clerk, wanted to participate but didn't have time to write. So he agreed to be interviewed, and one of the oral history class students, Elizabeth Praterigo, who's a PhD student at Loyola, interviewed him, and she prepared his essay for the book. So it breaks down to 76% women writers and 19% men writers, and 1 joint project. 33% of the writers are former faculty of Mundelein who also earned their degrees at Mundelein, so both worked at Mundelein and graduated from Mundelein. 28.5% of the writers are former faculty administrators, faculty/administrators who did not study at Mundelein, and 33% of the writers are former students who never taught or worked at the college. Again, the grad student does not fit any of those categories exactly. And then another statistic, this overlaps with the others, 28.5% of the writers are current members of the BBN congregation. What I didn't realize until I did this was it's a really pretty even breakdown, kind of 30-30-30 for the different groups that participated in the book, which I think gave the balance we were looking for but didn't work to achieve in quite so neat fashion. So now we're each going to talk a little bit about our own essay in the book.
Right, we had the pleasure of being both editors and also writers. So we talked about being historians and or writing memoirs, and I was a little bit intimidated by my own memoir in a way. It was like, oh my goodness, I don't really want to take on telling that story. But one of the things that I was quite fascinated with was the building. And of course, we were writing after the affiliation between Mundelein and Loyola, and the renovation or the physical restoration of the building had been done by Loyola, and so it had that security. But I was interested then in the way it would be interpreted and remembered. So my concern was kind of historic preservation and who will interpret this building, who will explain its significance now that it is one of Loyola's buildings. So that became my fascination then to take on a new approach to looking at physical space and architecture, kind of new forms of historical evidence. So I was able to do both, to do work on how it came to be, not just the college, but the actual engagement of people to build the building. And then to think about the building as a learning space and as a space for women, and the way in which being in a space that was created by women for women's learning, to be a place for women's learning, may be part of our discussion of what it means to be in a women's college, or to have a women's college experience empowering to women. That not so much what we taught in the curriculum as the very environment in which women see themselves in the world. So I had the help, actually, again, of a graduate student who was a public history student who kind of got me intrigued, Jan Nash, with how to look at a building in its historic setting. How did it fit into the city? How did it fit into the sense of women's empowerment? And actually, how was it constructed? So I was very grateful for her help, and was able to tell the story. At the time, if you had a chance to look at the essay, you'll realize that I felt my concern was very timely, because the Loyola student paper had done a kind of feature where they had done sleuthing around the Loyola campus to find places of interest, and they had come upon the skyscraper and reported it as a building that, in the rhetoric of the postmodern, was a polluted space. It was kind of deteriorating and decaying, the basement and the greenhouse and the 15th floor, which was not part of what had been renovated. So the portrayal, was very shocking in a way to me. And I thought, oh, here's the justification for why we need to be thinking about who interprets this building and how. And of course, since that time, we have a wonderful plaque outside that says, here's the history. And having written the article, one of the ways I'm taking it forward, I have the privilege of being a fellow and Ida Gannon Center for Women in Leadership next semester. And I talked with a colleague, Pat Mooney Melvin, about how maybe I would take time in that semester to talk to her about creating some kind of public history statement or visual display, or at least a guide to the building. So it's kind of an ongoing project that has engaged me.
in my essay, I was kind of like Prue. I wasn't ready to talk about the more recent history of my teaching career at Mundelein because I'd have to get into the affiliation, and it was too recent to talk about for me. So I went back to my student days and talked about a class apart, BBM sister students at Mundelein College, 1957 to 1971, because I came to Mundelein as a BBM, we called ourselves Scholastics, or we were called Scholastics, BBM Scholastics. I was a transfer student. My first 2 years were at Clark College in Dubuque, and then we all were sent en masse to Chicago. And we were told to keep a low profile so that the rest of the student body wouldn't think they were at a nun's college. I brought just two overheads to show you how hard it would be. This is the group that was 2 years ahead of me. So they were in the old heavens that I never wore. But they were to keep a low profile in the corridors. And then the second slide shows, or second transparency shows that the next habit we moved to, this is the one I wore. But this also takes us a little bit ahead in time because the group that's surrounding Rosalind Russell in this picture were called the Sheridan Road 10, and they were a music group. They were about maybe 4 or 5 years after me. We never would have been able to do anything like that when we were scholastics. But I do it most again to show the habit. And then in the third stage of the scholastics, by 1968, they were out of habit totally. So there was the whole scholastic program covered a short period of time, but a wide degree of change. So I decided to just pursue that idea a little bit about what it meant to be at the college, but not really a part of the college. And I couldn't trust my own experience, just purely my own, because there were so many of us, that I sent out questionnaires to a number of people to get their comments on what their experience was like. And mostly I was trying to focus on what was your educational experience like. Did it make a difference that you were a scholastic at Mundelein rather than just one of the regular students? Because we were not allowed to socialize with the students, which was a difficult experience. We had to go to class, and then after class, either to the library or right back across the street. We lived at the big building across the street that's now called Wright Hall. So I surveyed people, got returns, and what I came up with was a very common experience. Almost across, well, I would say 100% were very satisfied with their education. I didn't get one complaint. Now, there were a few who didn't return questionnaires, but not too many. But there was really no complaint about the education. A little bit of complaint about the not being a part of the regular college life. A lot of influence felt by being taught by almost all women. There were a fair number of men on the faculty, but the women, for the most part, were the administrators, president, dean, department chairs. So there was that notion of anything is possible if you want to do it. You can get a PhD if you want to get a PhD. Nothing was out of sight. So as I mentioned, the times changed radically while the scholastic program was in process. The assassination of John Kennedy, Vatican II, which totally changed the church, well, not totally, but had a major impact on the church and a major impact on our congregation. The civil rights movement, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, the civil rights movement, all of that was going on during this period. So it was a fascinating period, and I left my research with a lot of questions, a lot of unanswered questions that could deserve deeper research. And again, we presented at the Conference on the History of Women Religious this summer at Marquette. And again, got positive feedback and a lot of interest because there's a lot more writing going on now about women religious and women religious education, all that kind of thing. So people are interested in this beyond Mundelein, beyond Chicago. I don't know that I'll pursue it anymore, but at least we've created a little field of archival material that can now go into the Mundelein archives and perhaps will be picked up by future scholars. So I think that's should be the end of our presentation.
Should we introduce the writers?
Oh, yes. Well, we have several people who wrote essays. Tomi Shimojima in the red, who's too embarrassed to stand up and wave her hand. Gloria Kalechi. I think that was the two of us. And the two of us, and then I think I already pointed out Valerie Brown, the archivist from the Jackson back row there. And Sister Anna Gannon here in the front row, and Sister Janelle Bergen in the blue here. And Carolyn Farrell, I think maybe you all know, the director of the Gannon Center, without whose help this would have been a very difficult project. So now we're open to any comments or questions that you might have, any line of discussion.
This is incidental, but I was curious, what guidelines did you give the writers?
We worked very hard on it. Well, the guidelines that came from Women Building Chicago, the Dictionary of Chicago Women, were very thick and very detailed. So they inspired us to be really serious about this. And also the idea that you have many people contributing, it's like you don't want to end up with then having to figure out the format and all of that. So we worked hard on trying to select what was really essential. We had 10 kind of principles of approach. And that was where we put in the feminist idea. And it was also one of the guidelines where we said we were not going to address the affiliation. It was too recent and there were too many views about it. So we were going to do the history and end in 1991. So that also solved a certain problem about, what's the end of the story. So that remains a story to be told. And then, so we had to kind of establish the tone and the sort of framework and the approach we wanted people to take. And then we did a stylistic sheet. And one of the biggest problems was how do you refer to Sisters of Charity or the Blessed Virgin Mary? Because, as Anne pointed out, that changes were very dramatic over this time period. So some people knew the sisters as, Sister Mary and Ida, and some people knew the sisters as Anne, and and then some people knew Anne Harrington, and I'm trying to remember the religious name. Saint Remy. So it was, there were all these times of the religious name, the baptismal name, the family name being added in, and we finally had to say, use the name that you're comfortable using. But we had to work through some questions like that. A lot of it was standard, but there were some, that was the hardest problem.
Well, and we came to that, everybody doing what was most comfortable to them, because after first insisting, I forget what we insisted, but we did.
What was the last name, the sort of formal?
Oh, and the Sister Mary too.
Yeah, and
some
then
people said, I've never in my life called her Sister Mary, and I'm not going to do it in this essay. So, so we gave in and said, what works for you in the essay?
And the other problem I had was, like, if you said Sister Mary Ann Ida Gannon, and then the sort of formal academic prose was then you would say Gannon from then on. And I thought, well, she isn't Gannon, she's Sister Mary Ann Ida, or Sister Ann Ida. So, it's like, well, you use her name, and that seems like informal or not respectful, but so really, it was quite an interesting experience of looking at how do we understand women religious and, the use of the title. It was very
I
instructive.
say a word about names. We were encouraged to go back to our baptismal names after the council. And I considered it until I heard from some graduates who said, "Sister, you would invalidate thousands of degrees." So I stayed out. And we added our family name. Every sister in the order had Mary. And when we added our family name, it became a little long, so we dropped the formal use of Mary. But I had never thought of that aspect. Invalidate all of our diplomats.
It's like another whole history and trying to figure that out.
How did you solicit the input of the former students, the writers who were former students?
It was kind of the network.
People would throw out a name. There was no science to it, that's for sure.
Right, and we kind of had a sense of, time and undergraduates and then weekend college students. But it was really, we were more concerned about getting people who'd be willing to write than sort of sending out a broad invitation and waiting to see who responded. So it was kind of word of mouth and from the steering committee or from other people that we asked.
Did the others have total control over their subjects, or did you try to guide them wrong?
We made a list of things we thought needed to be talked about and said, could you select? But in the end, that might have inspired them or it might not have, and they selected what they wanted to write about. And as we move more toward memoir, the time at which they experienced Mundelein kind of became the choice they made, and they did different things. But yes, they had really total control of the story.
My claim to fame is the fact that I was a freshman student when the college opened in June, or rather September of 1930. You don't go back any further. Then some years later, after I joined the BVMs, I came back and was a history teacher, and then was dean of students for 13 years. So that I have an insight as having been a student and then having been a faculty member and an administrator. And I can't say enough about the dedication and the devotion of my community to the cause of Mundelein College. And I think it has paid off.
Have you had any reaction from the alumni about the book?
Well, yeah, we've had some, and most of it has been very positive. A couple one person pointed out that she looked through the entire book, every page, and she didn't find Sister Mary Pierre Flynn, who headed the home ec department.
I should have contributed
which was
it.
very well known.
Yes.
And was, I think, the only college in Chicago for sure who had the ADA approval. I mean,
Yes.
it's really
Yeah.
quite, and we were aware that there are major gaps, and that's one. That definitely deserved something, but
The
it
chief
didn't.
desire right now is for volume 2.
Yes, and that's what we're telling people. Anybody who has the impetus, there is room for another volume because there's a lot that's left out. We didn't talk. There's one entry from a person who was in the Graduate Liberal Studies program, but she really doesn't talk much about the program. That program deserves a chapter, definitely. I could go on forever, the things that aren't in it. But we felt at least if we started, we get people interested and then they'll go out and start working on something.
Well, those people who wrote favorably, what do they appreciate particularly?
Well, I had 2 letters that came in June, quite soon after the postcard went out that said it was available. And they both talked about how it just took them right back to the immediacy of their own experience. That was so wonderful. It was, it just, I guess, brought to life an aspect of their experience that had kind of been stored away, and this just kind of made it alive again, and they were delighted with it. So that was
Well, and the other thing I heard was people were just so happy that something was written about Mundelein because they had this great love for Mundelein, closed or merged or affiliated, whatever you want to use, but the old Mundelein was gone, and they wanted it somehow concretized, and they felt this was a start.
I had one letter which said, I didn't know that all that was going on in Mundelein. Didn't know that it was all, I was in a certain place and I didn't know all this was happening.
I'm an alum, and when I first got the book, I wanted to read about the period when I was a student. So I read those chapters first. And, as college students are, they're very self-absorbed, and they think that was the only time that Mundelein existed. And then as I, started from the beginning and started reading the history, and even the period beyond the time when I was there, which was in the late 60s and 70s, early 70s, it just made me appreciate so much the dedication of the BVMs for building the college, the sacrifices and risks that were taken in the beginning. And the chapter on the scholastics is fascinating because we had scholastics in class, and because we didn't interact with them, and I didn't know why. And that was very insightful, and I had done a lot of I was on the newspaper staff, so I had done a lot of reporting on the DCPs and the adult students. So I
Could you
was
tell us the name so others would know?
the DCP.
Your name?
Oh, Sheila McCarthy DeBonis, and I was here from '67 till '70.
And where was this my Sharon?
Yes, yes. And
You did research on the
DCPs.
what was that?
The degree completion program
Oh,
is the
Okay,
adult
I didn't know the name of that. Okay.
Part of my beat was to cover Dr. Ruby's office, and so I did many interviews with Dr. Ruby, and so I was familiar with that, more so than some of the other students. But it was just fascinating to just, from a distance, look at all the different aspects of Mundelein life, and of course appreciate how much it did for me as a student, and how it affected so many other people. And it's just a wonderful book, just wonderful.
Well, one of the elements that you brought up that's missing in my essay is the reaction of the student body to having all these nuns. I didn't even attempt that because there wasn't time, but I think that would be a fascinating addition to the
We
story.
had 12 other orders at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah.
12 other different habits running around.
And also at that time was when we started admitting male students.
Right.
Was that too, and that was, we had a lot of things to say.
Have you given any thought? It's a fair amount of work, but in some ways it may not be that hard. Of like circularizing of the whole graduate people. It's costly to send out a form, but you've done enough work now. Could you come up with 4 or 5 questions, or 6 or 7? Again, maybe not many people would respond, but on the other hand, if you have a mailing list, it might be one way of adding something to the archival record. If that's a unique thing because it's a finite bunch of people, and that again, even if you don't do anything with it, or write anything out of it, it's still something that really. And then with the book being out, that may prod people to put that in, because you talk about you get distance, obviously, but on the other hand, when you've got more immediacy with something, you have a fresher recollection of the last 10 or 15 years.
That's a good idea.
Again, it's difficult to devise a questionnaire, I'm sure of that, but if it could be done, if somebody would pick it up as a, just pick up the mailing fees or something like that, and then just storm it and see what kind of a response you got. And then people could look at, different aspects of what was going on. I remember, what was that thing, one of the talks they gave about, I don't know, writing about Dorothy Day or something. The woman did all these interviews, and she said she put the rest of them in the archives so that somebody could evaluate the one she didn't use in regard to the one she did use. But I think it would be a neat way of getting, maybe hundreds of responses of people, what it's meant in their life and what they feel, especially it is the last of the four-year colleges, whole question of women in society and the advanced degree program where you're coming back and getting, and they were probably pioneers in that. But this kind of thing could be really a wonderful archival tool that they would be doing all the work once you had the questionnaire set up.
That's a very good idea.
Well, Carolyn puts out the newswire. That would be a good, include a survey of the newswire.
That'd be an easy way, but most of it would be taken care of.
You kind of have to do a direct mailing now, I think, and that does get a little tedious. But I don't know if you have a computerized mailing list of graduates, there are thousands of them, then maybe it's not practical.
I did what Sheila did and looked first for those years when I was here. And I was disappointed that I didn't find much about them for 40, 48. And I wanted so much more about Sister Benedict because I just idolized her. I wanted a whole chapter on Sister Benedict. She was so wonderful and I was disappointed not to find that. But then just like you, Sheila, as I started reading the book, it was beautiful. It was just beautiful. And it brought you right back and you were there in the midst of that wonderful, learning-driven, energy-driven, involvement-driven milieu. It was wonderful. And you were very aware of, I think even when we graduated, we were aware of that. But it was nice to recall that and see how wonderful it was and what it did for us. You did leave us, all of us, with the feeling we could do and be anything. You really did. And it's a gift I gave to my children. It's a wonderful gift. Just no limits.
Well, now you've got to do the years from 44 to 48.
And one of the things, many things about sort of learning, you start one thing and then you learn a lot as you do it and it opens up other possibilities. I was really aware of how little work has been done on Catholic women's colleges. They constitute about a third of all women's colleges, I think, in the heyday of women's colleges, which is really a lot. We hear about Seven Sisters or whatever, but really the work that was done in Catholic women's colleges, such as Mundelein, is pretty much unwritten about it. And I think that the story of Mundelein is probably similar in many places, and that whole sense of women in the church, women's contributions to the development of American society. There's really a big story there for dissertation research or whatever, as well as further exploration. So I think we've kind of realized the need to tell this story, not only about Mundelein, but also to kind of recognize this whole educational endeavor, largely done by different communities of women religious all across the country.
Something that I realized at some point in my career, I was working in television production. I was doing a program on women's liberation, which was in the early 70s. And it occurred to me as I was researching this and actually talking about Gloria Steinem, that the nuns were the liberated women models before anyone knew the name. They represented achievement, professional achievement, and self-fulfillment in a way that other women didn't. And they didn't do laundry if they did other people's laundry. and wake up in the middle of the night and things. But I think they were a real role model for me. I never aspired to be a nun, but to have that kind of freedom.
They used to say that we were a third sex. They tried it out on us, and if it worked, they tried it out on women.
Well, I work in the Yellow House today, and I just found it interesting to learn about the history of that house, including the United Farm Workers lived there in the summer of '74, for instance. And the Religious Education Library was there from '67 to '73. A lot of interesting things that I picked up. Also having an affection being taught by BBMs at St. Gertrude's in grammar school, which isn't far away. So it was a great story, and how the founders were really tough with Cardinal Mundelein. They were great the way they interacted with him and got what they wanted, and got a great building.
I didn't think it was what we wanted.
Yeah, right.
My experience was reading. I was dyslexic with Anne, and I'm the one that should have written about Mary Pierre and Renee, and I never got it done, So I'm one of those ones that she didn't get the thing back from. And felt bad when I heard Anne's story that they were, they weren't in the book. But my experience too was that I was here. We were the first group that wore the last habit, and then we, went into the traditional habit while we were here. But there were pieces of even the Scholastic years that I didn't know about. And being a BBM, I was in the West, and so there were pieces of even the current history. And it really helped me, what parts I did read, helped me to understand maybe how hard it was to let the college go. And I never could quite figure that out from a distance, but now being back in the center of the congregation, that real tremendous love and the uniqueness of the college. And I think that's probably true maybe of Rosary and of St. Mary's of the Woods and whatever, but it's a particular love. And when I was talking about the book, right away my sister who went to Rosary said, I gotta have one. And then she said, I need one of these for my high school friend who came to Mundelein. But the interest of how it was for others and that identity with the later scholastics, I thought was a very interesting piece for me. And I loved your piece on Mary I. Griffin. I just felt I was in the office, and it was such a significant thing, and her death hadn't been too much earlier from the time I was reading it, and that was just really powerful.
She was the easiest person to write about I've ever written.
Yeah, that was very exciting, I thought, so. Well, we are very honored to have been asked to talk about our book, and we appreciate you all coming out tonight.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more back here. Oh, I'm sorry.
I graduated the year that Mundelein became part of Loyola, and I was a Loyola student, and I knew nothing about Mundelein, but I gained so much knowledge and information. It's great because I see the buildings out of my living room window, and so there's so many things. I'm like, wow, that happened just that little ways away, and I knew nothing about it. So great.
Oh, thank you. Well, they have some great refreshments here, and again, thank you so much for allowing us to talk about what we had so much fun doing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for doing it. Thank you for doing it.